The end of World War II brought about a new depression. War had cured the depression, but with its end came longer unemployment lines. Unions lost ground as well with the Taft-Hartley Act, making all closed shops illegal. The Democratic administration spent billions of dollars on education opportunities for billions of people. Between 1950 and 1970, America's prosperity was on the rise once again. Civil rights movements and new welfare programs appeared. Women had received far more jobs than they had post-war, but the constant clash between housewife and employee sparked a revolt in the 60s. As it became more financially attractive, many whites moved to the suburbs, and African Americans and minority groups moved to the inner cities, bringing their poverty with them. Immediately after World War II was a baby boom, but rates continued to fluctuate to extremes. During this period, Harry S. Truman succeeded the presidency after FDR's death. The former Big Three, Churchill, Roosevelt, and Stalin, had defeated Germany together, but in reality they had just been testing each other's boundaries. Mistrust between the U.S. and Russia ran deep, and once the common enemy had been obliterated, the two countries turned on each other. This was known as the Cold War. It started when Stalin blocked off land access to Berlin in his section of Germany. America flew supplies in, and so Russia removed its Iron Curtain, but bad feelings prevailed. Further ill will amassed when the Truman Doctrine, in which he used $400 billion to defend Greece and Turkey from Stalin. His Marshall Plan aided European countries financially. Despite warnings from the Arabs, Truman also officially recognized Israel. To begin preparing for a clash with Germany, a Department of Defense was created, as well as the CIA, among others. America joined NATO, or the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, designed to keep Russia out, the Germans down, and Americans in. It became the fulcrum of Cold War policy. Reconstruction was successful in Japan, but in China, Communist Mao Zedong overran nationalist Chiang Kai-shek, and China became officially communist. Russia began experimenting with atomic bombs. To ward off a potential attack, Truman had a more powerful bomb, called the hydrogen bomb, developed. It became a race to be the most powerful. Another Red Scare arose, and Truman allowed many trials to be held to ensure American loyalty, but vetoed the McCarran Internal Security Bill, which would have allowed arresting and jail sentences. However, 2 Americans were condemned to the electric chair for conviction of stealing atomic bomb plans and gave them to Russia. In the midst of this drama, Harry Truman was reelected. He advocated for a fair deal. This raised minimum wage, provided for public housing, and extended Social Security. In 1950, Korea imploded. North Korea's Soviets versus South Korea. Defense spending was quadrupled, and General Douglas MacArthur was installed to cooperate with and protect South Korea. He made a blunder by angering China, and when he disregarded Truman's instructions to pull out, he was removed. Many saw this as Truman appeasing communism. After World War II, science and technology ran the economy. Advertisements were greatly aided by the influence of the television. Music adapted to the new, more modern culture. Eisenhower and Nixon beat Adlai Stevenson in the 1952 election. President Ike went to Korea to calm communist tensions. However, in America, Joseph McCarthy renewed the Red Scare and charged, without proof, many individuals in the State Department. Although blacks were technically free, Jim Crow and other laws discriminated against them. Civil rights leaders like Rosa Parks and Martin Luther King Jr., among others, advocated more rights for African Americans. Former President Truman had fought for civil rights, but Eisenhower left the judicial branch to advocate. In the 1954 Brown v. Board case, separate but equal was overturned. President Eisenhower practiced dynamic conservatism, or being liberal with the people and conservative with their money. He supported many New Deal programs and built 22,000 miles of freeway. He was also involved in Little Rock 9. In foreign policy, Eisenhower practiced rollback of communism and created the Strategic Air Command. Eisenhower won the 1956 election. In 1957, the space race against Russia began. At the Camp David Accords in 1959, tension was released between Khrushchev and Eisenhower, but were tightened again after the U-2 spy plane incident. Fidel Castro took control of Cuba in 1959, ending diplomatic relations with America and beginning them with Russia. Kennedy became president in the 1960 election, thanks to televised debates against Nixon. After the war, most literature spurned realism and wrote satire about the war. Multicultural literature and plays also became popular. President Kennedy began the new frontier. He also desired to win the space race. Around the world, problems were everywhere. Defense Secretary McNamara proposed flexible response, which created the Green Berets and made the military more adaptable to all crises. In Vietnam, Kennedy continually sent thousands of American soldiers to their deaths. In the Bay of Pigs invasion to Cuba, America did not come, and it failed miserably. For 13 days, the Cuban Missile Crisis brought America to the brink of nuclear war. Kennedy called for détente, or relaxed tension, in the Cold War. Simultaneously, Kennedy worked for civil rights. In 1963, President Kennedy was assassinated. Vice President Lyndon Johnson assumed the presidency. Johnson's Great Society had major New Deal inspirations. In the '69 election, Johnson versed Barry Goldwater, and defeated him by making Goldwater look war-happy. President Johnson also defeated Congress by getting the Gulf of Tonkin resolution passed and increasing his power tremendously. LBJ used an alphabet reform system and began Project Head Start. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 continued to battle segregation and poll discrimination. This year began the extremely violent black protests. Martin Luther King Jr.'s assassination in '68 led to a quietly powerful force of blacks. In Vietnam, Johnson spent more American lives and money. He stopped the troops' supply in 1968 and announced that he would not run for a second term. Nixon was LBJ's successor. American teenagers became the beatnik generation. They became the hippies who supported drugs and free love. The beatnik generation had thought their prosperity would never end, but with inflation, it did. President Nixon's policy in Vietnam, the Nixon Doctrine, or Vietnamization of Vietnam, pulled all American troops from the war. In 1970, Nixon ordered an attack on Cambodia, but ended it 2 months later. Nixon's conservative Supreme Court ruling in Roe v. Wade legalized abortion. Nixon won the 1972 election, and in '73, a ceasefire with North Vietnam barely disguised an American retreat. With the War Powers Act of 1973, Congress attempted to regain power lost from the Gulf of Tonkin resolution, but mostly failed. The Watergate scandal broke in 1972 and ended in 1974 with Nixon handing over tapes that proved his direct involvement in the scandal, and then resigning before being impeached. Nixon's Vice President Agnew resigned due to a tax evasion, and Gerald Ford was named new vice president and therefore became Nixon's successor. Ford gave Nixon a full presidential pardon, making himself unpopular, and when South Vietnam fell to the North in '75, Ford was humiliated. During the '70s, feminism was on the warpath. The ERA was created and destroyed by opposing feminist groups. Black and white tensions exploded as well, with white flight to the suburbs. Jimmy Carter became president in 1976 and championed global human rights. In '78, he mediated the Camp David Accords. Inflation rose steadily and dependence on foreign oil was disheartening. Ronald Reagan became president in 1980. He cut taxes but was shot and injured in 1981. The tax and spending cuts ended up causing the public to think he had raised the deficit. Cold War policy of Reagan was to outspend the USSR and thus render them powerless, but it was not implemented. In the '80s, conservatism was increasingly popular, and Reagan's Supreme Court case decisions reflected the conservatism of the times. George H.W. Bush became the president in 1988. In 1989, the Cold War was all but over and democracy was making an impressive comeback. Then came the Persian Gulf crisis. Formerly American-supported leader Saddam Hussein attacked Kuwait. Operation Desert Storm brought Hussein to a surrender. Bill Clinton won the 1992 election for the Democrats. He shrunk the federal deficit and passed the Brady Bill to control guns and won the next election. Clinton had popularity that was mainly due to the prosperous economy. In foreign affairs, Clinton sent many to their deaths and did not make much lasting impact except for programs like NAFTA, the WTO, and the GATT. There were no worries or distractions for the American people, and so when Clinton was caught womanizing, all America could talk about was the scandal. He was impeached, but not dismissed from office. The 2000 election was won by George W. Bush, son of the former president. On September 11, 2001, disaster struck with a terrorist attack by al-Qaeda. It was led by Osama bin Laden, and when Afghanistan would not surrender him, a manhunt ensued. Saddam Hussein was allegedly creating WMDs, and Bush attacked and captured Iraq. In 2004 election, Bush ran against John Kerry and won by a modest margin.